Hi everyone, welcome to Shelf Isolation. This week I'm going to be talking about Toni Morrison's Beloved. And yeah, what a book. So much going on. I've read this a couple of times now. And each time I find something new and I find something interesting in the book. So even if you're not going to do this for coursework, I think it's a great book just to read for fun. Like, it's a really, really interesting book. So set in the mid 1800s, and when the book starts, we are placed in a house called 124 Bluestone Road. And on 124 Bluestone Road lives a lady called Denver, who we know is an ex-slave, and her daughter, no, a lady called Seth and her daughter Denver. Seth is an ex-slave, we learn that at the start. And with them lives a horrible, horrible ghost. So this ghost just causes havoc on the house. It's so mischievous and naughty and actually quite violent at times. And the ghost is believed to be Seth's other daughter who died. At this point, I mean, you will find out, and I'm not going to tell you in this video because it will totally ruin parts of the story if you want to read it. But we learn that this daughter died as a baby, and it's now causing absolute havoc on the house. So it's just those two and this ghost. But prior to that, lived with them Grandma Baby. So Grandma Baby, or Baby Suggs, as she's known to people in the community, is Denver's grandmother, but not Seth's mum. And with them also, and she died 8 years prior to the start of the book. And also with them used to live Howard and Bugler. And these are Seth's other sons. But these guys ran away a couple of years prior because they hated the ghost. So they really, really hated this ghost. And they just upped and left. But Seth always believes that they will return. So they're living with this ghost. It's causing lots of havoc. And on the first day where the novel starts, a man called Paul D comes to visit the house, and Paul D is thought to be we learn that he's Seth's friend from when she was a slave. Well, not sort of friend. Worked with her. He was also a slave, and he also managed to escape slavery. And they're talking about the past, and he ends up staying with them. And we get the impression that where they lived as slaves, it was a place called Sweet Home, and actually they were owned by quite benevolent, friendly, kind slave owners at one time. So it seemed like they're having quite positive reflections on their time as slaves, but actually we are always reminded that they were still slaves and they still had to escape. Even though their experience was probably much better than other slaves at the time. So they both escaped, and he comes to visit. And over the next few days, they enter into a relationship, and they become a couple. Denver is not happy about this. She is really, really not for this at all, because what he does is he scares away the ghost, and even though the ghost is naughty and horrible, actually Denver really likes it. She likes its presence because she feels that it's her sister, and she likes it being around. So we are then given kind of a bit of a flashback into Sweet Home, and throughout the novel we are given flashbacks and flash forwards, and we've got all these different running timelines and different voices and narratives, and it really gives us an impression that actually there are lots of stories that are untold, because sometimes these narratives conflict each other and sometimes they align, and the narrative switches quite a lot in the book. So sometimes it's third person, sometimes it's first person, and sometimes it changes without warning at all, like it just moves person essentially. So at Sweet Home, they're owned by the Garners, so Mr. and Mrs. Garner. And on this farm, we've got Seth, who's the only woman, and some other male slaves. So we've got Sixo, Paul D, Paul F, Paul A, so the three Pauls, and Hal. And all the male slaves are totally enamoured with Seth. They think she is beautiful. And it's hard to know whether they are just lustful after her because she's the only woman on the farm, or whether they really love her. But nevertheless, they don't touch her. They just wait for her to choose a husband to be with. And it's almost like it's a given that she will pick one of them to be with. And in the end, she picks Hal. But so from Paul's narrative, Paul D's narrative, he says that while they're waiting, they end up like having sex with the cows essentially because they are so lustful after Seth. And anyway, she picks Hal, and they end up getting married and have children. So when Seth managed to escape slavery, she has Howard, Bugler, and the baby girl that died. So at this time, she hasn't actually got her name. And one of the reasons they escape is because Mr. Garner dies, leaving Mrs. Garner in charge, but her health is totally declining, so she's totally bedridden by the time that they escape. And even though she really does respect the slaves and cares for them, and treats them with much more humanity than slaves were usually treated at that time, it was thought that a weak woman being on a farm with lots of male slaves was a bit inappropriate. So she gets her brother-in-law, who the slaves know as school teacher because he is also a teacher. So they don't really he's not really got a proper name, they just refer to him as school teacher. And he is a truly, truly evil man. So he's totally racist. He's abusive to the slaves. So where they were previously treated with like a level of humanity, they were called men, they were taught things, they were allowed to learn things, and they were given much more autonomy. School teacher absolutely takes that away from them and is awful. So he doesn't allow them to do like any kind of freedom. They're not allowed to leave the farm at all, even on their days off. And he's just totally abusive to them. So an example of what he does is if they kind of talk back to him, he'll put like a bit in their mouth, like a metal bit that you see horses sometimes wearing, and it just feels totally animalistic the way that he treats them. So for this reason, the slaves kind of discuss and think, okay, well, we're going to escape. But at this point, Seth is really heavily pregnant. So what she does is they come up with this plan to send some of the children first, and then she will follow. So they've organised it so that someone will come and pick up the children in the middle of the night, and then she will then follow, being pregnant with her husband Hal. So she waits at the right time and the right place for Hal to meet her so that they can escape, but he never shows up. But prior to this, school teacher suspects that the slaves are kind of getting their heads together and they're going to escape. So he and his nephews corner Seth in a barn, and they violate her the most horrendous way. So what they do is they steal her milk. So the nephews basically breastfeed off her, stealing the milk for her baby, and then they like totally whip her back. And the idea is that like she's going to, because she's also pregnant, she's going to be too weak to escape at this point. And she's totally disfigured, and Hal doesn't meet her, so she goes alone, and she does manage to escape, but it was a bit touch and go, is she going to survive, is she not going to survive? But she does get help from a woman called Amy Denver, who she meets on the way, and this is a white girl who she meets who helps her, and no one believes that Amy Denver exists, because it's like what white girl would help this slave who's escaping? But she does. She has the baby, and then she arrives at 124 to meet baby Suggs, who she then lives with. Okay, so I'm not going to say any more of the plot because I don't want to give too much away, but I do want to talk about some of the themes. So a really, really important theme in this book is identity, or the lack of. So throughout the book, we're given the impression that the slaves totally lack autonomy and identity. So Paul D constantly questions his manhood, and when the Garners are in charge of Sweet Home, they say, you're a man, you've got manhood, but he's always questioning his manhood because he thinks, well, am I a man because you say that I'm a man? and in which case I've not got this autonomy of manhood, or would I be a man anyway? And in any other circumstance, would that manhood be taken away from me? Also with Paul D, always questioning like his ability, and the slaves always, well, Paul D and Seth in particular, believe that they shouldn't love too much. They shouldn't fully love something because it's going to be taken away from them anyway. And Paul D's heart, metaphorically, is this closed up tin tobacco case, which he won't let open because he's worried that if he loves something too much, it's always going to be taken away from him. He's not got the permission to love things. And he talks about, not loving the moon fully, being outside and seeing a beautiful moon. He shouldn't love it too much because it's not his to love. So he kind of says like, you shouldn't love the moon, but you can actually love, some of the less bright stars instead. So Paul D constantly questioning his manhood, and then he's also got that bit in his mouth at some point. So, again, totally, lacking identity as a human being at this point. And then, of course, we've got his tin heart as well. Other ways in which or lack of identity is shown is, when Seth, so at one point Seth walks in on school teacher giving a lesson to his students, and what he's teaching them is the characteristics of the slaves, and he gets them to make a chart. On one side it's like human characteristics, and on the other side it's animal characteristics, and she hears him talking about her in particular as having these animal characteristics. And again, that's totally lacking personhood. It's totally dehumanizing them. Another way in which identity is shown is through the names of the slaves. So often when the slaves get their freedom, they pick a new name, or they actually give themselves a name, because very often they're just, so Sixo, in the book it's spelled Sixo, but actually we then learn that it's 60. So he's just a number really, but then he kind of makes that name his own, but then it's not a real name for him. It's not a chosen name. It's a name by circumstance, and Baby Sug's name in particular is another way that we see this. So on the farm, so she's actually from Sweet Home too, but someone buys her freedom. Her son buys her freedom for her. So when she's 60, she's allowed to leave the farm and go and live in the free world. And the Garners, even though they are really, really kind, they call her Jenny, and that's not her name at all. It's just what they think that she's called. And when she leaves, Mr. Garner says, "What's your name? What is your name?" And even though they're these really benevolent, well, not really benevolent, they're still slave owners. They're much more benevolent slave owners. They still don't know her real name, so she picks this name Baby Suggs because she says that, well, my husband always called me Baby, and his last name is Suggs, so that's my name. Oh my goodness, I'm running out of time. Another theme we see very, very briefly is community. The community of the free Black people in Cincinnati is really, really important to the book. And for this, we could maybe link in Captain Corelli's mandolin. Oh, also going back to identity. Theme really, really useful there would be a book to link, would be 1984, because we've got that lack of identity present. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up there. I realise I've talked quite a lot about the plot, but there's just so much to say about this book. So many layers, definitely worth a read. Let me know if you want to talk about it further, and have a good weekend, everyone.